All right. Hello, fellow sapiens. Sit back, relax, and prepare to meet your ancestors. Tonight we're entering the quiet centuries after the Bronze Age collapse, a time when cities emptied, writing faded, and whole civilizations seemed to exhale their last breath. This episode asks one simple question. What was life like in the first Dark Age, when the world tried to begin again? If you're new here, this is Sleepless Homo, slow storytelling for tired minds, soft science for late-night thinkers, and deep time told quietly, without noise. We explore the archaeology of being, one calm chapter at a time. Now imagine this. You wake to a world that feels familiar, yet something in the air has shifted. The fields lie quiet. The roads carry no caravans. The great cities on the horizon give off no morning smoke. It looks like dawn, but the world beneath it has changed. This is the morning after the Late Bronze Age ended, and the strangest part is that no one in that moment knew they were standing inside the opening hours of a dark age. They only felt absence, something missing in the rhythm of life, like a sound that used to echo across the landscape and suddenly went still. We do not know exactly what any individual saw on that quiet morning, but we do know what the stones, the ashes, and the broken storerooms tell us. They suggest a story of systems that collapse so completely it still feels impossible that it happened in only a few human lifetimes. Archaeologists call the Late Bronze Age one of the most interconnected eras the ancient world had ever seen. Across the Aegean, Anatolia, the Levant, and the inland plains stretching toward Mesopotamia, palatial centres operated as the beating hearts of their regions. Their walls stored grain, copper, tin, perfumed oil, imported pottery, elaborately decorated furniture, and entire archives of administrative clay tablets. In these palaces lived scribes, bureaucrats, metalworkers, diplomats, and the small circles of elite families who thought the structure around them was permanent. The people in these centres were tied together by trade routes that crossed seas and deserts, by marriage alliances between kingdoms, and by diplomatic letters written on tablets that still survive in fragments. In those letters, kings addressed each other as brothers, exchanged gifts of metals and horses, and negotiated the delicate work of maintaining peace. To us, it looks like a network held together by confidence in its own stability. And then, within the span of perhaps a century or so, concentrations of life that took hundreds of years to build simply unravelled. The archaeological record offers no single moment of catastrophe, but instead a mosaic of burn layers, collapsed roofs, abandoned workshops, and sealed storerooms never reopened by their owners. In site after site, we see the same pattern, the final debris of a once complex system, frozen at the hour it ceased to function. At places like Ugarit, evidence shows that messages were being written and sent right up until the very last hours of the city's existence. One letter found near the gate pleads for urgent military support. It never arrived. But we see no need here to imagine armies on the horizon or a single dramatic siege. The real story is quieter and stranger. These layers suggest that the mechanisms that held societies together had already started to fail before flames touched their walls. Trade networks were the first element to show strain. For centuries, the flow of tin and copper underpinned the entire Bronze Age economy. These metals did not come from the same place, so the production of bronze required long-distance exchange. If a drought hit one region, if political instability disrupted caravans, or if a port was abandoned for a season, the whole system could wobble. Some researchers believe environmental stress around the eastern Mediterranean, including prolonged droughts revealed through pollen analysis and sediment cores, may have reduced crop yields and increased social pressure. Others emphasize internal political tension, fragile elite economies, or shifting local power structures. We do not have all the answers. What we do know is that the old rules stopped working. When one palace faltered, others felt the consequences. When one workshop could not obtain raw metal, the neighbours who depended on its output faced shortages. Complexity became fragility. In many regions, the collapse is marked by sudden architectural silence. Palace complexes show collapsed ceilings still lying where the beams fell. Clay tablets remain scattered on floors that no one returned to clean. Storage jars fractured under the weight of debris, often still containing the remains of their last sealed grain. In some places, doorways were blocked by fallen stones and never reopened. These are the archaeological signatures of a system that ended abruptly. The people who had once organised the distribution of goods, collected taxes, arranged marriages between kingdoms, and recorded every transaction of their world were gone. And when their structures fell, they took with them the administrative memory that kept each region aligned. One of the most startling elements of this collapse is the disappearance of literacy in many areas. Writing is a fragile thing. It requires institutions, trained scribes, and stable archives. Without them, written language can vanish within a few generations. After the Late Bronze Age, some scripts simply disappeared from use. Linear B, the administrative script of the Mycenaean palaces, ceased to appear on clay tablets once those palaces burned. Ugaritic writing vanished with its city. The disappearance of these scripts does not mean language itself vanished, but it does mean societies lost their bureaucratic memory. Without archivists and scribes, there were no records of land boundaries, harvest quotas, or diplomatic agreements. Without written correspondence, distant kingdoms became silent to one another. The world shrank not by geography, but by the collapse of communication. When we picture the end of an age, our minds often drift toward noisy scenes of destruction. But the archaeology of the Late Bronze Age collapse speaks more softly. It looks like workshops left unfinished, as if craft workers put down their tools and never returned. It looks like pottery kilns cooling for the last time. It looks like trade routes overgrown by shrubs. It looks like ships no longer docking in harbours, where warehouses once overflowed with imported goods. And perhaps most hauntingly, it looks like the sudden absence of people. In some regions, the population appears to have thinned dramatically. Houses show no evidence of later occupation. Entire districts lie empty for generations. But absence is a kind of presence too. It tells us something important. People adapted in ways that didn't leave immediate traces. They may have moved inland, split into smaller groups, or shifted from palace-centred economies to local ones. For archaeologists, absence forces humility. What we cannot see may be as important as what we can. Not everything leaves a layer of ash or a collapsed wall. Some changes happen in silence, in decisions made under pressure, in families choosing to move from cities back to small rural hamlets. And though the great centres fell, human life did not stop. As we look at the archaeological boundary that marks the end of the Late Bronze Age, what stands out is not a single cause but a systemic unravelling. Every element of the old world relied on every other element, and when key parts weakened, the whole structure became unstable. Palaces depended on long-distance trade. Trade depended on political stability. Stability depended on agricultural surplus. Surplus depended on climate, and climate is never guaranteed. When any one part faltered, the others followed. By the time rulers wrote desperate letters asking for grain, for metal, for military support, the system was already collapsing beneath them, and the collapse was not uniform. Some cities burned, some were abandoned without destruction, some shrank gradually, Some experience temporary revival before final decline. The pattern is irregular, but the direction is clear. Imagine again that morning after the collapse. The first light touches the sea. Fishermen push out boats that now have fewer destinations. Farmers look at fields that yielded less the previous season. Administrators wake to a world without messages from neighbouring courts. Children run through streets where new goods have not arrived in months. No one announces that an age has ended. No one calls their time a dark age. But they feel something closing and something else beginning. The stability their grandparents took for granted no longer exists. What we see from the archaeological record is that the Late Bronze Age ended not with one event, but with the collapse of confidence in systems that once seemed eternal. The palaces that stored wealth and knowledge proved vulnerable. The scribes who kept the world's memory could no longer sustain their networks. The complexity that once defined the age became its weakness. And from the quiet that followed, a new world slowly emerged, though its shape would take centuries to form. In science, we try not to speak in certainties about events so distant and so complex. We say instead that the evidence suggests patterns. Burn layers suggest conflict or disaster, but not the precise cause. Abandoned houses suggest migration or decline, but not who moved or where they went. The collapse of literacy suggests loss of institutions, but not how people adapted without them. And so we speak softly about the Late Bronze Age collapse, acknowledging what we know and what we cannot know. We trace the end of an age through pottery, pollen, ash and silence. This morning after the collapse is one of the deepest thresholds in the archaeology of the ancient world. It marks the end of the old palatial system and the beginning of something smaller, more fragmented and more human-scaled. And though we often focus on the later Iron Age revival, this moment of ending is equally vital. It is the point where large-scale order gave way to uncertainty, where monumental architecture yielded to scattered villages, where the world of kings shrank and the world of everyday people widened. In this silence, in this pause between ages, we begin our journey. We stand with those who woke to ruins they did not expect, to fields that offered less, to warehouses filled with things no longer useful, to archives that would never grow again. And as we step forward, we carry the humility of not knowing every cause, every reason, every human decision. The evidence gives us a shape, the rest must remain open. What we do know is that civilizations do not end in a single moment. They end in the gap between what a society expects and what the world can offer. And when that gap becomes too wide, even the stronger systems can become fragile. From this threshold, we will follow the traces of those who lived after the collapse, but first we honour the quiet ending itself. The morning when a system older than memory began to dissolve, leaving behind stones that whisper the same lesson across millennia. Continuity is an illusion, and every age rests lightly on the edge of the next. If you find comfort in this kind of gentle, factual storytelling, consider softly tapping the like button or subscribing. It helps other sleepless sapiens find this corner of quiet history. And before we begin, tell me, where do you usually listen? Before sleep, while driving, while cooking, or through headphones in the dark? I read every comment, and if you drift off along the way, the timestamps are below so you can return to any moment you missed. All right, let's continue. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. Imagine this. A farmer standing at the edge of a field that has always obeyed the seasons suddenly finds the soil refusing to answer. The ground is dry in places where it used to hold morning dew. The barley heads are thinner. The wheat grows unevenly, its colour slightly wrong, as if touched by a quiet sickness. The farmer has done nothing differently, the same hands, the same tools, the same rituals, and yet the world around him is shifting in ways too slow to see and too vast to fight. This is one of the most unsettling truths of the centuries leading into the Late Bronze Age collapse. The climate began to change in ways no kingdom understood, and the weather itself became the first and last adversary of a system already stretched to its limit. What if I told you that some of the earliest signs of this unravelling are not found in burned walls or broken palaces, but in pollen grains buried deep beneath lakes and marshes? These microscopic markers, each lighter than dust, have outlasted every lost kingdom. When scientists pull sediment cores from the bottoms of lakes across the eastern Mediterranean, they are reading a botanical diary spanning thousands of years, layer by thin layer. These cores record what plants were growing, what crops thrived or faltered, and how landscapes breathed during each season. And the story they tell about the centuries before the collapse is sobering. Many of these cores show a steady decline in pollen from oak forests and other moisture-loving plants around the end of the 13th century before the Common Era. In their place, we see an increase in species that tolerate dryness. It is as if the land itself began to whisper that rains were becoming unreliable. At the same time, isotopic signatures inside ancient shells and cave formations offer another dimension of this slow transformation. Stalactites and stalagmites, forming drip by drip inside limestone caverns, contain ratios of oxygen isotopes that shift depending on rainfall patterns. When the climate is wetter, the ratio changes one way. When it is drier, it changes another. These chemical fingerprints remain locked inside the stone for thousands of years. When researchers examine samples from caves in Anatolia, the Levant, and regions further east, many show a pattern of extended aridity during the late second millennium before the Common Era. It is not absolute. Climate shifts are rarely uniform, but the signal is strong enough and widespread enough to suggest that people across these lands were facing increasing stress long before any walls fell. A drought is not simply a lack of rain. It is the slow tightening of a system. Agricultural fields become harder to irrigate. Streams shrink or disappear. Pastures brown earlier in the season. Water tables drop. Reservoirs and cisterns empty. And when a region already depends on large coordinated systems of food distribution, even a temporary shortage can put enormous strain on the political and economic fabric. The Late Bronze Age was not a world of isolated farms. It was a world of palace-centred economies that relied on the predictable flow of crops from rural communities into central storerooms. Those storerooms, in turn, redistributed grain to specialised workers, to soldiers, to labourers, and to the elite households that governed everything around them. When rains failed, the burden fell first on farmers, then on the pallets of those responsible for feeding thousands. And once a palace could no longer fulfill its obligations, trust began to fracture. In sediment cores taken from the Sea of Galilee, scientists have documented a sudden and dramatic increase in plankton flourishing in nutrient-rich water that might sound positive, but it actually indicates that water levels were far lower than normal around this time. Shallow lakes often experience blooms like this. The implication is clear. Bodies of water across the region may have been shrinking. This kind of environmental stress can unsettle the agricultural calendar. Harvests that once followed a reliable rhythm begin to vary. One year brings a poor yield. The next brings an even worse one. A third year crushes the reserves meant to stabilise the system. And slowly, quietly, the promise of stability that palatial societies depended upon weakens. Imagine being the scribe responsible for recording harvest totals during these years. You would walk the fields with a wax tablet, tallying grain that used to fill carts to the brim, but now barely half fills them. You would calculate distributions, knowing you cannot meet last year's quotas. You would watch as your neighbours begin to worry, as the palace demands remain the same, but the fields cannot obey. None of this leaves a dramatic archaeological signature, but it leaves a human one, felt in the anxiety of every official who had to report disappointing harvests to rulers who expected constancy from a landscape that no longer offered it. There is also a quiet ecological clue that adds depth to this picture. Pollen records from Cyprus, Anatolia and parts of the Aegean show that certain crops commonly associated with Bronze Age agriculture began to decline, while hardy shrubs and grasses became more common. Some researchers suggest that this pattern reflects not only reduced rainfall, but also overexploitation of the land. If forests were cut faster than they regenerated, or if soils were strained by centuries of intensive agriculture, then a period of drought could have amplified these stresses dramatically. In this view, the climate shock did not act alone. It revealed weaknesses already present in the system. The climate evidence becomes even more intriguing when we look at marine cores taken from the seafloor. These cores, containing tiny shells from marine organisms, also store isotopic information about past sea surface temperatures, rainfall, and river discharge. Several studies suggest that the eastern Mediterranean experienced pronounced drying and cooler temperatures in the centuries around the collapse. Cooler seas may have reduced evaporation and rainfall. Such changes could disrupt weather patterns over vast regions. And because Bronze Age societies were closely tied to agricultural cycles, even small shifts could cascade into large consequences. What makes the climate story particularly compelling is how it intersects with the archaeological record without overshadowing it. We do not need to imagine massive storms or sudden environmental catastrophes. The picture is quieter and, in some ways, more devastating. These societies were designed for predictability. Palatial economies function like engines that needed constant input. When rains faltered and crops shrank, the engine began to sputter. At first, people likely believed the cycle would correct itself. Rains might return next season, reserves might last until then. But as drought years accumulated, the gap between expectation and reality widened. It is in that widening gap that collapse begins. Imagine the uncertainty creeping into households across the region. Farmers debating whether to plant the same crops or switch to drought-resistant varieties. Families wondering whether their stored grain would last the year. Administrators anxious over dwindling contributions from rural districts, and elite households finding that the wealth they once took for granted no longer flowed into their storerooms. Climate stress rarely destroys societies directly, but it strains them. It exposes their weaknesses, and it forces decisions that ripple outward in unexpected ways. We must be careful here, as scientists and storytellers, not to reduce the collapse to a single cause. Climate is a powerful force, but it interacts with culture, economy, and politics. What we can say, humbly, is that the environmental data strongly suggest a period of reduced rainfall and cooling across parts of the Mediterranean and Near East during the centuries that framed the Late Bronze Age collapse. We can say that pollen records show changes in vegetation consistent with prolonged aridity. We can say that isotopic evidence points to reduced water availability. And we can say that these patterns would have put enormous pressure on agricultural systems that supported large urban populations and central administrations. Beyond that, we can only trace possibilities. Climate did not break the world on its own, but it helped loosen the stones. So what does this climate shock mean for the people who lived through it? It means that in the decades before palaces burned and administrators abandoned their archives, families were already facing uncertainty in their most intimate relationship, the relationship with the land. The soil that fed them became unpredictable. The rains they depended on arrived late or not at all. The streams that once brought life into fields shrank into narrow channels, and once that happened, every aspect of their world began to feel less certain. As we move deeper into the archaeology of this period, we'll see how societies responded to the pressure. But here, standing at the threshold of the collapse, the climate story tells us something essential. The unravelling did not begin in the courts of kings. It began in fields where crops weakened, in lakes that receded, and in trees that stopped growing. The earlier signs were ecological, and they passed unnoticed by the rulers who would later face the consequences. Climate shifts do not announce themselves. They whisper through pollen, drip water, chemistry, and soil. They leave their messages for us, not for them. And so we look back with humility, understanding that even the grandest systems remain tied to forces beyond any human control. The climate shock of the late second millennium before the Common Era reminds us that civilizations depend on rhythms that cannot be commanded. They can plan for abundance, they can store surplus, they can build reservoirs and canals, but they cannot change the sky. From this early environmental stress, a chain of consequences unfolds that we will explore in the next part of our journey. But for now, it is enough to stand in the quiet fields of that distant age and imagine the moment when people first realized that the rains were changing, not dramatically, not loudly, but enough to reshape the world they knew. You walk into a city that should be loud, a place where potters once sang at their wheels, where metal workers struck bronze in rhythmic clatter, where children chased one another between market stalls, and where the smell of bread drifted from communal ovens long before sunrise. But now the streets are empty, the hearths are cold, the workshops are quiet. A clay jar lies cracked beside a doorway, half buried in dust. A roof beam leans inward as if exhausted from waiting for someone to return. The silence is not peaceful. It feels unfinished, like a sentence left mid-breath. This is the first great emptying of the late Bronze Age world, and the archaeological layers from around 1190 to 1170 before the Common Era show a pattern so widespread it still unsettles researchers today. What if I told you that the most striking part of this period is not destruction, but absence? In many cities there is no evidence of massive fire or battle. Instead, there is a curious pattern of abandonment. People simply stopped living in places they had inhabited for generations. They left storerooms half-organised, workbenches with tools still on them, and jars still sealed with the remnants of grain inside. It is as though entire communities stood up one morning, gathered what they could carry, and walked away without closing the door behind them. Archaeology allows us to see this emptying through material traces. When excavators peel back layers of soil, they look for patterns. Was the city destroyed? Were walls intentionally dismantled? Did people loot buildings before they left? And in many regions around the Mediterranean, the answers are subtle. Palaces that once hustled with scribes and administrators show collapsed ceilings, but no signs of looting. Residential quarters contain objects left exactly where they were last used. Hearths hold the blackened remains of their last fires. Food storage pots sit untouched. These imprints suggest not a violent event, but an interruption. A life paused. In some cities, entire neighbourhoods show evidence of rapid departure. Abandoned loom weights still hang from wooden beams, their threads long gone. grinding stones remain on the floor beside bowls of grain not yet milled. In elite residences, ornate furniture and imported pottery lie where they fell as roofs deteriorated over time. Archaeologists often describe these layers as snapshots, frozen moments of departure, preserved by the slow, patient burial of dust and debris. They're glimpses into a world where someone had intended to return but never did. One of the clearest clues comes from the storerooms of palatial complexes. These places typically held vast quantities of agricultural products, oils, metals, textiles, and administrative tools. When cities thrived, storerooms were carefully organised spaces, their contents catalogued on tablets and regularly inspected. But in layers dating to this period, archaeologists find storerooms left in disarray. Some shelves are empty, others still hold large jars undisturbed. The pattern is inconsistent, which suggests not a coordinated evacuation, but a gradual dimming of activity. People stopped bringing goods in, they stopped taking goods out. Eventually they stopped coming altogether. Collapsed irrigation systems offer another clue. Many Bronze Age cities relied on elaborate canals, channels and reservoirs to nourish fields around them. These systems required constant maintenance. Without it, canals silt up, walls crumble, and water flow dries into fragmented trickles. Archaeological surveys show that in many regions around the eastern Mediterranean, irrigation networks fell into disrepair during this time. Sediment layers inside canals tell us that water once flowed strongly, then weaker, then barely at all. Once irrigation faltered, fields around the cities would have yielded less, and the incentive to stay would have diminished. The city did not need to fall for its lifeblood to drain away. It is tempting to imagine dramatic scenes, crowds fleeing, smoke rising, panic in the streets, but the evidence rarely supports such images. Instead, it suggests something quieter and more complex. People left not because their walls were burning, but because the structure that kept urban life functioning had weakened. A city is not just buildings. It is a network of expectations. It is the belief that grain will arrive at the storeroom next month, that water will flow down the canal in spring, that potters will bring their wares to market, that officials will enforce agreements, that neighbours will remain. When these expectations break down, the physical city may still stand, but the urban fabric is already gone. Consider the pottery. Pottery is one of the most stable archaeological indicators because it survives fire, abandonment, and time. During the centuries leading into this emptying, many cities produced distinctive pottery styles, often tied to workshops within their walls. But in the strata dating to this abandonment period, local production declined sharply. In some places it stops entirely. The final pottery layers often contain a mix of older vessels and imported pieces repurposed many times. This suggests that potters either left or no longer had the economic support to continue their craft. When a city's artisans disappear, its heartbeat weakens. Without fresh pottery, storage becomes difficult. Without storage, surplus becomes unstable. Without surplus, the entire urban organism becomes vulnerable. One of the most evocative discoveries from this period comes from residential houses where toys, small figurines and household items were left behind. These objects carry traces of daily life that abruptly ceased. A child's clay animal figurine found beside a threshold, a cooking pot still coated with residue from its last meal. These intimate details do not match the image of a city violently destroyed. They match the image of people who walked away because the city they once knew no longer offered what they needed to survive. Archaeologists sometimes speak of collapse as if it were a singular event, but here it feels more like a fading. The first great emptying is not a moment but a process. It unfolds over years or even decades. It is marked not by a final day, but by a gradual withdrawal of people from spaces that had defined their lives. And across the Mediterranean world, many cities show this same pattern during the late 12th century before the Common Era. They do not fall in identical ways, but they fall in parallel. We can see this pattern in the layers where small plants first take root inside abandoned rooms. In some excavations, seeds of hardy pioneer species appear directly above layers of human activity. These seeds belong to plants that thrive in disturbed or empty ground. Their presence shows that buildings were not reoccupied for long periods. Nature began to reclaim the streets. Vines crawled up walls. Dust filled courtyards. Over time, windblown soil accumulated on rooftops, and in some cases trees began to grow inside former homes. The archaeological record preserves these transitions, marking not the destruction of cities, but their quiet surrender. The silence of these places is perhaps the most striking evidence. Archaeologists working in abandoned cities often describe a kind of psychological weight in the air. The ruins hold the memory of human activity without the humans. It is a silence thick with the sense of missing voices, not destroyed, not erased, just gone. And what makes this period so unusual is how widespread that silence was, from the Aegean to parts of Anatolia, from sections of the Levant to inland settlements. Cities that had thrived for centuries entered a period of stillness at roughly the same time, not perfectly synchronized, but close enough to reveal a regional pattern rather than isolated incidents. This pattern forces us to ask difficult questions. What does it mean when cities go empty, not because of a single catastrophe, but because their systems no longer sustain life? What does it mean when absence outnumbers ruins? And what does it mean for archaeologists who must interpret silence with the same care they interpret artifacts? We must remain cautious. Archaeology shows us material remains, but not the full story of why people left. It shows us jars, walls, seeds, drain pipes, and pottery, but not the conversations families had before deciding to leave a city behind. It does not tell us where they went or whether they hope to return. It only tells us that they left marks of departure that align across many sites. And from those marks, we infer patterns carefully, always aware that there are things we cannot know. Walking through the archaeological layers of these abandoned places feels like walking into a pause in history. The energy of urban life had drained away, leaving behind an architecture of memory, and as we move forward in time, other forces will shape the future of these regions. But for now we remain with the silence. We stay with the empty rooms, the abandoned courtyards, the storerooms no longer visited, and the streets where no footprints followed the last ones that faded in the dust. The first great emptying reminds us that collapse is often quiet. It is not always marked by fire. Sometimes it is marked by the absence of hands to keep the city alive, and in that quiet, the world shifts. Imagine this. A world where the last sound of a stylus scratching wet clay fades, and no one notices that it will never return. A world where the scribes, once the quiet architects of memory, walk out of their offices for the final time without realizing they are closing the door on centuries of written thought. There is no ceremony, no declaration, just the slow, unrecorded dimming of a skill that once defined entire civilizations. This is what the archaeological records suggest happened between roughly 1180 and 1150 years before the Common Era. The day writing went quiet, and with it, a way of thinking. What if I told you that civilizations rarely understand the moment they lose their words? They only feel the consequences later, when the absence becomes unavoidable. But we, looking back through layers of ash, clay, and silence, can see the outline of this disappearance with startling clarity. The clues lie in emptied archives, fallen shelves of tablets, and the sudden halt in the bureaucratic chatter that once tied palaces together. For centuries, scribes wrote everything from grain allotments to diplomatic formulas, from tax receipts to lists of sacrificial offerings. Their work created an enormous paperless archive made of clay and permanence. And then, within a few decades, entire writing systems vanish from the record in the Mycenaean world. The script known as Linear B had been the backbone of palace administration for generations. It is a script carved with care, built for record keeping rather than poetry. Scribes trained for years to master its signs, each stroke representing an administrative function. When archaeologists uncovered the palace archives at Pylos and Knossos, they found hundreds of tablets describing a world of inventories, land holdings, offerings, and political structures held together by precise written control. And then, sometime in the late 12th century before the Common Era, these tablets stop not slowly. Not after a transition, they simply stop. The same silence appears in Ugarit, a city that once housed one of the most sophisticated scribal cultures of the Eastern Mediterranean Ugaritic writing. Written in a cuneiform alphabet, captured myths, letters, trade accounts, and legal codes. The city's archives contain diplomatic correspondence with distant kingdoms, lists of imported goods, an entire mythological text that predates some of the world's most famous literary works. But in the layers dating to around 1180 before the Common Era, the clay tablets lie scattered across floors beneath collapsed ceilings, and the script disappears from history. Not because it evolved, not because it merged into something new, but because the community that sustained it no longer existed. This disappearance teaches us something vital about writing. It is not only a technology, but a social system. It requires specialists who dedicate their lives to mastering it. It requires institutions that employ and protect those specialists. It requires surplus resources to fund scribal schools, scribal workshops, and scribal families. And it requires a stable bureaucracy that needs records enough to support the profession. When palaces weaken, the scribes become vulnerable. Without them, scripts tied to their work fade quickly. Archaeological evidence shows that many late Bronze Age writing systems were tightly linked to palatial administration. Linear B tablets, for example, were not baked intentionally. They were sun-dried and only hardened by accidental fires that destroyed the buildings they were stored in. This means tablets that survived did so only because catastrophe preserved them. Without new tablets being created in the next generation, the script had no future. The same is true of many cuneiform systems. Their survival depended on active scribal traditions constantly copying older tablets to create new ones. Once that chain breaks, the script stops breathing. Imagine a young apprentice in one of these scribal schools during the last decades of the 12th century before the Common Era. He wakes in the morning, picks up his stylus, and practices signs on a small piece of clay while listening to older scribes debate a list of grain allocations. He expects, as all apprentices do, that the world of administration will continue after him. He expects that his skill will grant him a place in society, and then one year the palace reduces its staff. The next year, fewer supplies arrive for scribal instruction. Eventually the school closes, not because the knowledge has been forgotten, but because the system that needed it has vanished. His stylus becomes a tool with no purpose. The archaeological layers from this period reveal storerooms where tablets lie broken but undisturbed. Some rooms appear to have been used briefly as shelters after the abandonment of palatial offices. Others were left entirely untouched. When excavators find tablets lying exactly where they fell, with no later layers of scribal activity above them, it signals a final moment. The last entries on those tablets are not dramatic. They are routine. Procurement lists, ration schedules, supply inventories. The mundane details of a system unaware that its final breath is near. In some abandoned archives, clay labels used to tag bundles of materials remain scattered on the floor. These labels once hung from baskets or boxes containing goods assigned to specific officials or storerooms. Their presence suggests that materials were still being moved and catalogued in the final days. But after that, no further labels appear. This abrupt silence is one of the most striking signals in the entire archaeological record of the late Bronze Age collapsed civilizations that wrote extensively suddenly stopped speaking. One particularly evocative example comes from the Palace of Pylos. In the final destruction layer, hundreds of Linear B tablets were found scattered across several rooms. Some tablets bear deep impressions from the roof beams that fell onto them. The scribes who wrote these tablets were likely working until the final hours. Yet after the destruction of the palace, no evidence suggests that writing continued anywhere nearby. There are no transitional forms, no continuation of Linear B in smaller settlements, no new administrative centres carrying on the tradition. It is as though the script was tightly bound to the palace and died with it. The loss of writing does not mean the loss of thought. Of course, people continue to speak, to remember, to teach through storytelling, to pass knowledge orally. Oral tradition is one of humanity's oldest strengths, but the shift from written to unwritten cultures reshaped how societies organized themselves. Without written records, land boundaries became negotiable. Without written inventories, surplus became unpredictable. Without written correspondence, long-distance alliances faded. A world that once tracked everything from livestock numbers to ceremonial offerings found itself navigating without a map. The archaeological record shows the consequences clearly. In post-palatial settlements, artifacts become more locally produced and less standardized. Architectural styles vary more widely. Trade networks become more fragmented. None of this is accidental. All of it reflects the absence of scribal oversight that once ensured consistency across vast regions. A world without writing becomes a world without the administrative glue that holds large systems together. Imagine wandering through one of these abandoned archives today. You kneel beside a clay tablet, its once sharp signs now softened by time. You hold it in your hands and think of the scribe who wrote it, unaware that he was among the last voices of his writing tradition. You look around and see rows of tablets, some cracked, some perfectly preserved, all silent. The room feels heavy, not because of what happened, but because of what did not happen afterward. No one came back to copy these records. No one trained the next generation. No one wrote again. This period between 1180 and 1150, before the Common Era, marks one of the most profound intellectual shifts in ancient history. It is the moment when writing, which had shaped economies, politics, and culture for centuries, fell quiet across wide regions of the Mediterranean and Near East, not everywhere, of course. But in many of the central palatial societies that once dominated the late Bronze Age world, writing became a relic of the past within a generation. As we examine these layers, we must resist the temptation to impose a single explanation. The disappearance of writing is a symptom of deeper disruptions that affected institutions, economies, and communities. But by focusing on the silence itself, we can trace how deeply writing had been embedded in the fabric of society, and how quickly that fabric unravelled. Standing in these ruins, surrounded by clay tablets that will never again be read in their proper context, we remember that writing is one of humanity's most fragile inventions. It survives only as long as people continue to need it. When their needs change, even the most sophisticated scripts can vanish without ceremony. And it is in this fading, this quiet retreat of written memory that we see the first outlines of a new world struggling to form. You're standing at the edge of a field your grandparents once called generous. The soil here used to crumble softly between the fingers, dark with moisture, rich with promise. Now it feels tired, dry in patches, harder to turn with a wooden plough. A thin line of cracked earth snakes through the barley rows where the irrigation channel no longer reaches. The canal that once fed this land has not been cleared in years. Silt has risen like a quiet tide, choking the narrow runnels that should have carried meltwater from the hills. The sound of moving water, once the heartbeat of the countryside, has become irregular. Every farmer in this valley knows it, even if they do not say it aloud. This is what survival looks like in the decades after the world of palaces and scribes fell silent. It is not dramatic. It is not heroic. It is slow, daily, and intimate. It begins with soil that refuses the old rhythm. What if I told you that the collapse of a palace is only half the story, and the other half happens here, in fields where people wake every morning trying to coax one more season from a landscape that no longer follows the rules? By the time we reach the period between roughly 1170 and 1150 years before the Common Era, the great administrative centres of the late Bronze Age have already dimmed. Rural farmers who once lived under their shadow now face the world without the redistributive safety net those centres provided. There is no longer a palace promising grain in years of shortage, no scribal official checking yields and adjusting rations, no warehouse storing the surplus of better years. Instead, families must navigate an environment where each harvest feels precarious. Archaeology leaves its record not in words, but in the material leftovers of daily struggle. In some regions, survey data shows that small rural hamlets persisted even as cities emptied. Their architecture is surprisingly modest. Single-room houses of mud brick, reed roofs, small cooking hearths, and storage pits dug into the soil. These are not the grand residence of administrators. They are the homes of people living close to the land, relying on what they can grow themselves. But even these small houses show signs of strain. Hearths contain more burned wild plants than before. Storage pits hold thinner layers of grain. Grinding stones show extended use with deeper wear. These subtle clues suggest that farming families were stretching their resources further than usual, making do with less, and supplementing their diet with whatever the hills or scrublands could offer. The irrigation networks present an even clearer picture of difficulty. In many regions, canal systems that had once required regular labour to maintain simply fell into disuse. Without the palace mobilising workers seasonally to dredge silt, reinforce embankments, and clear blockages, the canals silently declined. Archaeologists can see this in the sediment layers that accumulate inside the channels. The deeper the silt, the longer the abandonment. And by the 12th century, before the Common Era in many places, the silt lies thick. Without functioning canals, fields that depended on artificial watering became vulnerable. Farmers had to choose between planting crops closer to shrinking water sources, letting distant plots go fallow, or shifting to hardier grains. None of these choices guaranteed survival. Imagine a farming family discussing their options as the river runs low. They gather in the evening around a small fire, weighing the risks of planting the usual wheat against the possibility of switching to barley, which tolerates drought better. Barley does not fetch the same value in trade, but trade channels have already shrunk. Value has become a luxury word. What matters is yield. They may decide to plant both, hoping at least one will survive. Their choices reflect fear and resilience folded together. Communal granaries, once tied to large systems of redistribution, also show signs of reduced use in this period. In earlier centuries, granaries were stocked not only for local families, but for palaces that coordinated storage across entire regions. After the collapse of central authority, the granaries shrink. Some disappear entirely from the archaeological record. Those that remain often contain only modest stores. Their walls show little maintenance. Roof timbers rot. Rats and insects leave traces of feasting on grain that could not be fully protected. These details tell us that storing surplus had become more difficult. When harvests barely meet the needs of each household, there is little left to store or share. Seasonal migration becomes another clue. Archaeological surveys in hill regions, river valleys, and coastal plains show shifting settlement patterns during these years. Some small communities appear for a generation and vanish. Others emerge in marginal areas not previously used for farming. This suggests that families moved more frequently than before, chasing better soil, better rainfall, or simply better luck. They may leave behind hearths cold but intact, or storage pits partially filled, moving on before the land can fully sustain them again. These migrations are not long-distance journeys. They are local, incremental, reflective of a world unmoored from its former stability. Another subtle indicator comes from animal bones found in rural households of this period. In stable times, livestock herds are carefully managed. Farmers keep breeding animals, cull selectively, and plan for long-term herd growth. But in these layers, archaeologists find patterns of less controlled slaughter. Younger animals appear more frequently, and herds seem smaller. This suggests that in difficult years, farmers consumed breeding animals out of necessity, knowing it would weaken the next year's yield but having no alternative. It is a quiet sign of desperation, the kind that does not leave dramatic ruins but changes everything for those living through it. We must also consider the emotional world of these farmers. Imagine watching the fields you sowed fail 2 seasons in a row. Imagine relying on canals that no longer carry water. Imagine a granary that once offered security now standing half empty. The psychological weight of such uncertainty shapes behaviour. People store what they can, hide reserves in small clay jars buried beneath floors, ration portions more tightly, and teach children to gather edible plants from hillside. Survival becomes a daily skill rather than an inherited expectation. And yet, amid this difficulty, there is also evidence of resilience. Some rural settlements show new storage techniques that emphasize flexibility rather than abundance. Instead of relying on communal granaries, households create multiple small storage pits, spreading risk across different parts of their home. If pests invade one pit, the others may remain safe. This decentralized approach reflects a shift from dependency on palace redistribution to household-level management. It is a smaller system, but one better suited to the unpredictability of the time. Domestic pottery of this period also reveals adaptation storage jars become thicker and more robust in some regions, possibly designed to withstand longer use or better protect grain. Cooking pots show signs of innovative shapes that conserve heat or allow for cooking with limited fuel. These are not the choices of people thriving. They are the choices of people trying to endure. Consider also the role of community. Even as palatial authority disappeared, rural families did not live in isolation. They helped one another dig channels, repair walls, harvest quickly before a storm, and defend small plots. Archaeological evidence shows shared courtyards, communal ovens, and wells used by multiple households. These structures highlight cooperation, not collapse. Communities adapted to the loss of centralized support by strengthening local bonds. A village that relied on itself had a better chance of surviving than one that waited for a system that no longer existed. We must be careful not to romanticize this resilience. It came from necessity, not choice, but it speaks to something universal in the human story. When structures fall, people improvise. When the world shrinks, they learn its new boundaries. When the surplus disappears, they learn to live with less. The rural populations of the 12th century before the Common Era did not write their names into history the way kings and generals did, but their survival is the foundation upon which later societies built themselves. Without farmers enduring these harsh decades, nothing that followed would have been possible. Archaeology invites us to reflect on what it means to survive without a system. It means solving problems alone that used to be solved collectively. It means replacing certainty with constant adjustment. It means making decisions under conditions of fear and scarcity, and it means learning that life continues even when institutions fail. By the time we reach the later decades of the 12th century before the Common Era, many of these rural communities have settled into this precarious way of life. Their fields are less predictable, their granaries smaller, their canals unreliable, but they persist. They find ways to adapt, to endure, to rebuild structure from the bottom up. In their quiet resilience, we see a different kind of history, one written not in palatial archives, but in fields, hearths, and the memories passed through families who lived on the edge of survival. The wind moves through a ruined doorway, carrying dust across a floor where a family once cooked, laughed, and worked. Now, instead of residents, quiet footsteps pass through. People who do not belong to the city that once stood here. People who arrive not as conquerors, but as wanderers. In the decades between roughly 1160 and 1140 years before the Common Era, the landscapes of the Eastern Mediterranean were filled with such figures, not armies, not settlers, but the displaced, families and small clans drifting between the skeletons of former kingdoms, searching for safety, resources, or simply a place to stop for a while. Their presence marks the first reshaping of the world after the great systems collapsed. What if I told you that the most important people in these years are ones who left almost no written memory of themselves? Archaeology records them not in inscriptions or monuments, but in the smallest of traces. A shallow hearth built inside an old palace corridor, a cluster of coarse hand-made pottery buried in a corner of a long-abandoned storeroom, a patch of trampled earth suggesting a temporary camp beneath a city wall. They appear as shadows in the archaeological record, not fully visible, but unmistakable. Picture a family approaching a ruined city near the end of the 12th century before the Common Era. They see smoke rising from their small fire, reflecting faintly on broken stone. They know this place once belonged to others, to a system of power far too large for them to comprehend. Now it is simply shelter. A roof beam still holds, a wall blocks the wind, and the remnants of ancient storage jars can be repurposed to hold rainwater. They do not come as conquerors. They come because there are few other places left to go. Archaeologists identify these families through what we call secondary occupation layers. These layers lie above the destruction or abandonment levels of older cities, but below later Iron Age structures. They are often thin, short-lived, and lacking organised planning. Instead of new houses built in neat rows, we find fireplaces made directly on top of rubble. Instead of official storage rooms, we find makeshift pits dug into collapsed floors. Instead of carefully crafted pottery tied to established workshops, we see coarse wares made quickly by hand, sometimes shaped unevenly or fired at low temperatures. All these clues point to people living with limited resources and no larger administrative support. One of the clearest signs of displaced communities is the presence of temporary hearths. A hearth is a signature of life. It shows warmth, cooking, and the basic daily rhythm of survival. But in these layers, hearths are often built in places where they make little architectural sense, in partially collapsed palatial corridors, in what used to be storerooms, even on the roofless upper floors of buildings. Such positioning tells us that these people were not following old urban plans or traditions. They were improvising, using what was available, creating small pockets of life inside a world that no longer held structure. Imagine walking through one of these spaces. A cracked stone threshold leads into a room where someone has laid a circle of stones for a fire. The air smells faintly of smoke long since extinguished. A few animal bones lie scattered among the ashes, broken to extract every last piece of marrow. These bones, when analysed, tell us about diet and scarcity. They show that displaced families often relied on whatever animals they could hunt or scavenge, rather than livestock they owned. Some bones come from species not commonly eaten in the preceding centuries, suggesting a shift born of necessity. Pottery fragments from these layers reveal something just as telling. They are thicker, simpler, and less standardized than earlier forms. Many bowls and jars from these decades are handmade rather than wheel-thrown, indicating production by households rather than trained potters. Some vessels seem to imitate earlier styles but lack their precision. This suggests that displaced people may have learned pottery through memory or observation, not through the structured apprenticeships once available in palace economies. Pottery becomes not an art but a tool of survival. The reuse of ruined structures also provides insight. In many abandoned cities, archaeologists find that people cleared small areas of debris inside larger complexes, creating makeshift living spaces. They rarely repaired walls or rebuilt roofs fully. Instead, they chose corners that still offered shelter and left the rest untouched. These patterns tell us that their stays were temporary. They might remain for a few months or a few years, depending on resources and safety, but they did not commit to rebuilding. Their life was transient, shaped by unpredictability. Sometimes we find traces of these groups in places where no major settlement had existed before. A cluster of shallow pits filled with charcoal and broken pottery on a hilltop. a series of footprints preserved in hardening mud near a spring, a rough enclosure made from branches and stones. These are the signs of people who move through landscapes lightly, leaving marks that only archaeology's careful eye can detect. They represent a shift from rootedness to mobility, from structured life to fluid existence. One poignant example examined by researchers shows a reused chamber in a once grand building, where a family left behind fragments of a cooking pot, a grinding stone, and a child's small clay bead. The bead is crude, uneven, likely shaped in moments of rest. It reminds us that even during displacement, lives carried on, children played. Families cooked meals. People tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy amid uncertainty. The rise of the displaced did not happen suddenly. It emerged from layers of stress already unfolding in the countryside. As irrigation systems faltered, harvests diminished, and local violence increased in some areas, families left their original homes seeking safer or more fertile ground. But when they arrived at former centres of power, they found not revitalised cities but ruins. And these ruins became temporary sanctuaries. Daily life during these years was marked by improvisation. Without palatial grain redistribution, families relied on seasonal foraging, small gardens, and limited animal husbandry. Archaeologists find new patterns of plant remains in these layers: more wild seeds, more drought-resistant plants, and fewer domesticated staples in some regions. This suggests diets shifting toward whatever could be gathered quickly, rather than what could be cultivated with reliable return. Communal identity also began to change. Families who once lived under the same political authority now formed new micro-communities. Archaeological evidence shows clusters of hearths near one another, suggesting multiple families or extended kin sharing a space. Yet unlike the structured neighbourhoods of palace times, these clusters lack formal planning. They represent communities formed through necessity, shaped by movement rather than tradition. Tools found in these layers show signs of extensive repair. Bronze blades resharpened repeatedly until they snapped. Handles replaced with mismatched materials, broken implements repurposed for new uses. These marks reflect both scarcity and ingenuity. When metal production centres fell silent, people kept older tools working as long as possible. Some tools were found buried with individuals, perhaps prized as symbols of stability in a world where new metal was difficult to obtain. One of the most revealing aspects of this period is how quietly these displaced groups moved. They left no inscriptions. They raised no monumental buildings. They did not leave behind clear cultural signatures that later archaeologists could label as belonging to a specific group. Instead, their identity lies in traces of adaptation, in the charcoal of short-lived hearths, in the pottery made quickly by hand, in the reused rooms where they waited for the world to settle. Imagine waking each day inside a ruin you did not build. You do not know if you will stay another month or leave tomorrow. You watch the horizon for signs of danger. You cook meals from whatever the land offers. You repair your tools carefully, hoping they last. You teach your children to be quiet when footsteps echo through stone nearby. This is the life of the displaced during these decades. Not heroic, not epic, but profoundly human. Archaeologists must work carefully to interpret these layers, aware that the people we see here did not intend to leave records behind. Much of their world existed between moments of movement and moments of rest. But through the fragments they left, we glimpse the earliest hints of how society reoriented after the collapse. Not through grand strategies, but through small acts of survival. Through families taking shelter in ruins, through communities forming around shared fires, through the quiet persistence of life in places where institutions had vanished. By the middle of the 12th century, before the Common Era, these displaced groups had become a defining feature of the landscape. They were not the builders of the next age, but they were the bridge between worlds. They kept the thread of human presence intact while the old order dissolved. And in their wandering, the first outlines of new social forms began to emerge. Imagine this. A kingdom that once stretched from the Mediterranean coast deep into Nubia now feels strangely small, as though the edges of the world have crept inward. The palaces still stand. The temples still gleam beneath the sun. The colossal statues still stare across the desert as if nothing has changed. And yet, beneath the surface, everything is shifting. Grain prices rise like water in a sealed jar. Soldiers grumble quietly about unpaid rations. Priests whisper of shortages in temple offerings. Officials write complaints on papyrus with a brittleness that feels new. This is Egypt between roughly 1140 and 1100 years before the Common Era, the last kingdom standing in a world where nearly every other power of the Late Bronze Age had cracked or fallen silent. What if I told you that Egypt's survival was not the triumph of a thriving empire, but the endurance of a tired one? Archaeology and surviving texts suggest a nation clinging to stability through sheer inertia, propped up by long traditions, deep agricultural roots, and a bureaucratic memory that stretched back for centuries. But the cracks were there, in the economy, in the administration, in the very idea of what Egyptian kingship meant. Egypt lived through the collapse not because it was strong, but because it had just enough internal cohesion to weather the storm a little longer. When we look at the late 20th dynasty, we see a kingdom still capable of projecting power on paper, but increasingly strained. Grain, the lifeblood of Egyptian society, becomes the most revealing clue. Records from these decades show rising inflation, with basic commodities costing significantly more than they had in earlier centuries. Workers at Deir el-Medina, the village of craftsmen responsible for building royal tombs, famously went on strike during this period, one of the earliest recorded labour strikes in world history. Their grievance was simple. They had not been paid their grain rations on time. That a group of specialised workers felt the need to refuse labour tells us how fragile the economic foundation had become. Inflation in ancient Egypt was not merely an inconvenience. It was a sign that redistribution, the promise of the state to feed those who served it, was failing. When the flow of grain faltered, the entire administrative body trembled. Officials wrote anxious letters. Foremen assured workers that payment was coming, even when it was not. Priests noted shortages in temple stores, and all of this happened while Egypt still technically functioned as a unified kingdom, while its neighbours, Hatti, Mycenae, Ugarit, had already dissolved. The shrinking borders of Egypt during this time are another quiet marker of decline. Only a century earlier, Egyptian influence had reached far into the Levant. The pharaoh's armies and envoys moved through Canaan, enforcing treaties, collecting tribute, and overseeing fortified garrisons. But by the early decades of the 11th century before the Common Era, much of that influence had evaporated. Foreign lands that once sent gifts now acted independently. Some Egyptian garrisons were abandoned, others simply ceased to appear in records. The world had become too unstable for Egypt to maintain its old footholds. Imagine a scribe standing on the docks of an Egyptian port during these years. Ships still arrive, but not as many as before. Some come seeking grain in times of shortage. Others bring news of vanished cities or disrupted trade routes. The scribe writes reports that feel increasingly uncertain, as though he is documenting a world shrinking around him. He still believes in the endurance of Egypt, but even he can feel the tightening at the edges. Inside Egypt, the administrative system continued to function, but with mounting strain. The bureaucracy that had once maintained monumental building programs now struggled to uphold basic order. The temples, long-time pillars of power, grew even wealthier in land and influence at a moment when the royal treasury thinned. This imbalance contributed to internal tensions. The throne needed the temple's support, yet the temples increasingly operated with autonomy, controlling large estates and employing thousands of workers. In some regions, temples became de facto local authorities, managing resources that once flowed into the royal court. One of the most revealing windows into this era comes from the wave of tomb robberies recorded in papyri from the late 20th dynasty. These accounts are not dramatic stories of lone thieves sneaking through the night. They describe organized groups, sometimes including officials, breaking into royal tombs, stripping gold from coffins, and melting down treasures that had been intended to last for eternity. The brazenness of these acts reflects more than economic desperation. It reflects a fractured moral order. The kings of earlier centuries had been divine, their tombs were sacred. But by the late 20th dynasty, even the resting places of pharaohs were vulnerable. Imagine the atmosphere in Thebes during the height of these robberies. The Valley of the Kings, once guarded with ritual vigilance, becomes a landscape of violated silence. Tomb workers, priests, and administrators gather for investigations. They take testimonies, sometimes forcing confessions. Officials write detailed reports describing how thieves broke through sealed entrances, entered burial chambers, and removed the gold leaf from wooden coffins. These reports are some of the most vivid documents from this era, and they speak not only to crime but to a world where respect for royal sanctity was dissolving. The pharaoh who presided over much of this turbulent period was Ramses XI. He reigned for decades, yet almost nothing about his rule suggests confidence or expansion. Instead, his reign feels like an extended attempt to hold on. Borders retreat, wealth evaporates, the central government weakens. The king's authority becomes uneven, stronger in some regions and weaker in others. He's not a conquering pharaoh but a caretaker of a fragile system. Even so, Egypt survived. Its agricultural base along the Nile remained more stable than the rain-fed fields of the Levant or the palace-managed farmlands of Mycenae. The river still rose, even if years of low inundation created difficulties. The decentralized nature of farming, small villages working their own plots within a long tradition, gave Egypt a resilience that more centralized palace economies lacked. The land itself helped the kingdom endure. The temples, though sources of tension, also served as stabilizing forces. Their wealth, while diluting royal power, ensured local communities had some continuity of ritual, employment, and food distribution. Priests maintained offerings, organized festivals, and kept aspects of spiritual life intact even when political life frayed. In this sense, Egypt's survival was as much religious as political. Consider the daily life of an ordinary Egyptian during these decades. They would still see processions along temple avenues. They would still leave offerings for household gods. They would still tend fields, repair fishing nets, and grind grain with familiar tools. But beneath this continuity lay anxiety, rising prices, rumours of tomb robbers, complaints about officials, and the sense that the world beyond Egypt's borders had become unpredictable. It is a life balanced between persistence and worry. Archaeology supports this layered picture. We find continued pottery production, but with more variation in quality. We find settlements that remain occupied but lack the architectural ambition of earlier centuries. We find evidence of trade, but far less than before. Egypt didn't collapse, but it contracted, tightened, and redefined itself under pressure. If we walk through an Egyptian temple built centuries earlier, the precision of its carvings, the massive scale of its columns, and the orderly nature of its inscriptions stand in sharp contrast to the papyri of the late 20th dynasty that describe shortages and crimes. This contrast reminds us that ruins do not capture decline, documents do, and the documents of these decades speak with a tone of exhaustion. Yet Egypt endured. It remained recognizable even as it changed. Its resilience came not from untouched strength, but from long-established patterns of life that could bend under stress instead of breaking. When others fell, Egypt wavered. When others vanished, Egypt dimmed. But it did not disappear. In standing at the edge of collapse, Egypt shows us that longevity in history is not always a story of triumph. Sometimes it is a story of holding on, through memory, through land, through institutions too deep to dissolve in a single crisis. And in these quiet decades of the late 20th dynasty, we see the last glow of the old Bronze Age world flickering, but not yet extinguished. Imagine this. While the great palaces of the lowlands flickered out one by one, high in the mountains the fires never fully went dark. In the deep valleys of Anatolia, the ridges of the Caucasus, and the folded limestone spines of the Zagros, small strongholds still sent smoke into the sky. Stone towers clung to cliffs. Narrow terraces held thin fields of barley. Goat bells echoed where armies once marched. The claps that humbled the plains didn't reach these heights in the same way. Here, life bent but didn't break. And in the decades between roughly 1130 and 1100 years before the Common Era, the mountain nations began to descend, not as conquerors of the old world, but as survivors of their own long traditions. What if I told you that the people most prepared for the end of empires were those who never relied on them in the first place? Archaeology across the mountainous belts of the Near East suggests that upland chiefdoms, small fortified towns and scattered clan-based societies possessed a kind of resilience that the large palace economies lacked. Their strength did not come from surplus but from adaptation, from landscapes that had always been harsh, from social structure accustomed to scarcity and independence. When the plains faltered, the mountains simply continued being what they had always been. Imagine the view from one of these fortified hill settlements, a cluster of stone houses built into a narrow ridge, a small watchtower rising just above the tree line, terraced fields descending in careful steps toward a valley. The people who lived here were not elite scribes or wealthy merchants. They were shepherds, hunters, farmers on slopes, and leaders whose authority came less from bureaucracy and more from personal alliances. Their homes were simple but durable, their defences modest but strategically placed, and their lives demanded constant negotiation with terrain, climate, and neighbours. Archaeological surveys in these highland zones show continuity, where nearby lowlands exhibit abandonment. Sites in the Anatolian plateau reveal fortified enclosures still inhabited during this period. The walls are not grand or decorated. They are thick, functional, designed for defence rather than display. Inside, pottery remains consistent with earlier traditions, a sign that cultural practices persisted through the collapse with fewer disruptions. One of the most telling discoveries in these regions is the long use of upland storage rooms built into bedrock or thick stone walls. These storage structures often held grains or dried foods that could survive long winters. Unlike palace granaries, which relied on redistribution and organised networks, mountain storage belonged to households or clans. That meant resilience. If one valley struggled, another might still hold reserves. If the plains lost crops to drought or conflict, mountain communities already lived closer to the margin and thus adapted with fewer shocks. Mountain economies were also diverse. People grew barley and millet in small terraced plots, herded goats and sheep across seasonal pastures, hunted in forests, and traded selectively with lowlands. When the lowland routes collapsed, upland communities lost some trade goods but not their survival strategies. They had always been self-reliant. Their wealth was in mobility, seasonal rotation, and intimate knowledge of the land. Picture a shepherd moving his flock along a narrow mountain path in the early 12th century before the Common Era. The world of empires below him has changed, but the grass still grows in the high meadows. The springs still flow from the rocks. The animals still know the routes. He is aware of the turmoil beyond the mountains, perhaps hearing stories from travellers or refugees, but his life's rhythm is shaped more by the slope of the land than by the fate of kings won. Archaeological pattern that repeats across these mountain regions is the spread of small fortifications. They appear in strategic positions overlooking valleys or trade routes. Some are little more than a few stone towers and walls. Others form the core of modest hilltop towns. Their purpose seems clear: control movement, protect herds, shelter communities during raids. These defences were likely not new. Many had existed for generations. But during this transitional period their importance grew. They became symbols of stability at a time when the plains were full of uncertainty. Another piece of evidence comes from the types of weapons found in upland sites. Mountain groups relied heavily on spears, daggers, slings, and simple defensive shields. These weapons were practical, easily repaired, and well suited to the rugged terrain. In contrast, the elite chariot-based warfare of the plains required open ground, specialized training, and complex metalwork. When palace economies collapsed, chariot warfare faded, but mountain fighting traditions, which emphasized ambush, high ground, endurance, and familiarity with landscape, remained fully functional. In a world of broken trade networks and disrupted armies, these tactics offered a strategic advantage. Pottery analysis also reveals something important. Highland pottery styles tend to remain conservative. They do not show the abrupt shifts in design, common in lowland regions after collapse. Instead, they show gradual evolution, indicating cultural continuity. Many vessels were handmade, not mass-produced, meaning that upland households never relied heavily on palace-run workshops. Their economic independence contributed to cultural resilience. Consider the role of social organisation. Mountain societies were typically built around extended families or clans led by chiefs, whose power was personal and relational. Authority did not depend on written bureaucracy or palace storage systems. It grew from shared labour, kinship ties, and the ability to protect and negotiate. This decentralised structure meant that even if one group suffered losses, others could continue without collapsing the entire system. Fragmentation was already part of daily life, making these societies capable of absorbing shocks that shattered more centralised kingdoms. Archaeologists find evidence of raiding economies in these upland zones, and this too helps explain their endurance. Raiding was not a destructive impulse alone. It was a strategy of survival in environments with limited resources. When lowland systems weakened, upland groups were well positioned to take advantage of abandoned settlements, unused fields, and disrupted caravans. They collected metal from ruined cities, harvested remaining crops, or used abandoned lands for grazing. This behaviour was not new, but the opportunities expanded dramatically in the collapse years. Imagine a group descending from a mountain enclave to a lowland plain, where fields lie fallow and villages stand empty. They move lightly, harvesting what grain remains, repairing tools with metal they salvage from broken structures, and carrying supplies back to their highland homes. Their presence is not dramatic enough to be recorded in inscriptions, but their footprints exist in ash layers and in suddenly mixed material cultures found at the boundaries between mountains and plains. We must be careful not to oversimplify this picture. Some upland communities undoubtedly suffered. Some may have been destroyed. Some may have migrated. But the general pattern shows that in the 12th and early 11th centuries before the Common Era, highland zones across the Near East maintained more continuity than lowlands did. They were shaped by older pressures, winter scarcity, steep terrain, mobility, that ironically prepared them for the collapse of larger systems. Another fascinating clue comes from animal remains. Highland diets remained consistent, based heavily on goat, sheep, and occasionally deer or wild boar. In the lowlands, where cut marks and butchery patterns shift dramatically during collapse, upland sites display continuity. This reflects a stable subsistence strategy tailored to rugged environments and less dependent on surplus or external markets. Architecture tells the same story. Mountain houses built from stone blocks, sometimes partially dug into hillsides, show long spans of occupation with minor modifications. In contrast, lowland houses around this time often show abandonment, sudden destruction, or irregular reuse. Mountain architecture endures because it was built for endurance. Thick walls, compact plans, low ceilings that conserved heat. These design choices were not luxuries but necessities in cold, elevated climates. The way people stored food in the mountains also reflects long-term resilience. Rock-cut silos, clay-lined pits, and above-ground granaries made from stacked stone allowed families to keep grain through difficult seasons. These storage forms could withstand raids, storms, and the unpredictability of upland weather. When lowland palace granaries ceased functioning, upland storage remained intact. Even burial practices reveal continuity. In some upland regions, tombs carved into cliffs or built with large stones show continued use during the collapse years, with grave goods remaining modest but consistent. This contrasts with lowland shifts, where grave goods often become sparse or disappear altogether, another sign of disrupted systems. Imagine this. The land lies quiet. The fields that once fed empires are choked with weeds. Irrigation canals fill with silt. Granaries stand hollow, and the wide roads built for wagons crumble under wind and time. But across this devastated landscape, thin trails appear, faint, shifting, and almost invisible unless you know how to read them. Hoof prints, worn patches of earth where animals rested, ash circles from small fires. These are not the traces of armies or settlers. They belong to families who never needed palaces, storerooms, or city walls. They belong to pastoralists, the nomads who moved lightly across the land long before the collapse, and who, when the great kingdoms fell, simply kept moving. What if I told you that the societies once seen as the most fragile were the ones best equipped to outlast the chaos of the early 11th century before the Common Era? Archaeology and environmental data suggest that pastoralist groups, those who lived by herding animals through seasonal migrations, thrived in the very conditions that shattered agricultural and urban systems. Their resilience came not from strength as we usually define it, but from flexibility. When the world broke, they moved through the cracks. Picture the scene. A small clan guiding goats and sheep across scrubland where wheat fields once grew. They walk along ancient boundaries that no longer matter. A ruined village falls behind them as they head toward a distant spring. No one chases them away. No official asks for tax or tribute. The land has opened in a way it hadn't for centuries, and the nomads know how to use it. Archaeological signatures of this expansion appear subtly. scattered across regions that had relied on palace-centred agriculture only a few generations earlier. Layers that once held evidence of dense farming now contain dung accumulations, hoof-worn paths, and temporary fire pits. In some valleys, botanical remains shift from cereal grains to grass species favoured by grazing animals. These clues show that livestock populations increased and moved more freely while human settlements grew sparse and small. Nomadic societies had always existed alongside the Great Bronze Age states, but their relationship with the land was fundamentally different. Farmers required stable fields, functioning canals, predictable seasons, and social structures capable of organising labour. Nomads needed only grass, water, and room to move. In stable periods, this mobility made them marginal. In collapse, it made them resilient. Consider the logistical advantage of mobility. When drought hit, farmers had to endure it. When canals broke, they had to wait for someone with authority to organise repairs. When fields failed, they suffered shortages. In contrast, pastoralist clans simply moved to the next area with grazing potential. Their houses were tents or shelters built quickly from local materials. Their wealth walked with them. Their identity was tied to kinship, not territory. They were not bound to any single patch of earth. Imagine a drying valley in the decades around 1100 years before the Common Era. Farmers face a shrinking harvest. Their neighbours have already left. But a pastoralist group moves down from a nearby plateau, their animals feeding on wild grasses that have overtaken the abandoned fields. They use the cracked mud brick walls of a collapsed farmhouse as a windbreak. They gather wild barley growing among the ruins. They drink from a well that had once served a thriving settlement. For them, this land is not a tragedy. It is opportunity. Fire pits left behind by these groups show how lightly they lived upon the land. Small rings of stones, sometimes containing both domestic and wild animal bones, appear in short-lived occupation layers. These are the signatures of people who stayed a few days or weeks before moving on. Unlike sedentary farmers, they left no heavy architecture, no deep trash deposits, no infrastructure. Their archaeology is ephemeral, but its timing is unmistakable. It spreads precisely when the lowland administrative world disappears. One of the most fascinating aspects of pastoralist resilience is how it shaped their social structure. In the absence of states, their kinship networks functioned as flexible political systems. Leadership was often situational, based on negotiation, personal prestige, or the ability to guide herds safely through dangerous terrain. Such systems adapted easily to shifting landscapes. When one region deteriorated, clans could merge temporarily with others, share resources, or divide again without destabilizing a centralized authority. This adaptability offered stability in a time when the world around them was losing its institutional coherence. Animal bones from early 11th century layers across the Near East show increased frequency of sheep, and goat remains relative to cattle. This suggests a pivot towards species better suited to mobile herding and dry climates. Sheep and goats tolerate harsh terrain, require less water, and reproduce quickly, making them ideal for families who needed dependable, renewable resources. Their increasing presence in regions once dominated by intensive agriculture highlights a clear ecological shift. Imagine a child from one of these nomadic communities walking beside the herd. For them, these lands are not ruined relics. They are pathways, open routes connecting seasonal pastures, waterholes, and temporary camps. Where sedentary populations saw crisis, the pastoralists saw continuity. Archaeology also preserves evidence of flexible shelter construction. Post holes arranged irregularly, shallow pits filled with charcoal, and traces of woven mats or reeds suggest that small groups set up temporary structures in the lee of old walls or under the shade of surviving trees. They often built fire pits against collapsed buildings, using the ruins as windbreaks. These camps were never meant to last. They reflected a worldview that embraced impermanence. Nomadic success was not driven solely by mobility. It also stemmed from their relationship with risk. For farmers, risk was catastrophic. A failed harvest could mean starvation. For pastoralists, risk was manageable. Animals could be traded, slaughtered, or moved depending on conditions. Herd composition could shift, camp routes could adapt. Social bonds could redistribute burdens. This fluidity made pastoralist groups exceptionally capable of navigating landscapes destabilized by drought, warfare, and political collapse. Consider the technological aspect. Pastoralists relied on simpler tools. Their toolkit included slings, spears, knives, and wooden implements. They had no need for elaborate bronze workshops or imported goods. When trade networks faltered, their material culture continued almost unchanged. Their economy, being built on animals, was inherently renewable. A herd that survived one bad season could multiply in the next. A field could not recover so quickly. Archaeological studies show that during the collapse period, the distribution of animal pens and dung layers expands into new territories. This suggests pastoralists occupied regions previously too densely controlled by palace systems. The lions of bureaucracy were gone, and the shepherds moved in nomads also benefited from knowing the land intimately. Their seasonal migrations had always required a map of springs, hidden valleys, and safe routes. In chaotic times, such knowledge became power. Refugees, displaced farmers, and small communities often followed pastoralist trails because they were the only reliable path through an uncertain world. But this era was not without difficulty for pastoralists. Competition over grazing areas could intensify. Drought could force long, dangerous journeys. Conflict with neighbouring groups could erupt without centralised authorities to mediate. Yet even these challenges played into nomadic strengths. They were used to negotiating boundaries, shifting alliances, and protecting herds. They had no walls to fall, no palatial storerooms to lose, no bureaucracies to collapse. They had fewer things that could break. Imagine a broad plain at sunset in the early 11th century before the Common Era. The ruins of a once great city lie on the horizon, its silhouette softened by blown sand. In the foreground, a shepherd whistles and his flock turns, dust rising around their hooves. The world that shaped his ancestors is gone, but his world endures lightly, quietly, without ceremony. If the collapse taught the sedentary world that permanence was an illusion, it showed the pastoralist world that the land still belonged to those who could move with it. The nomads who outlived empires did not outfight them. They outlasted them. Their resilience came not from strength, but from adaptability, not from wealth, but from mobility. And through their survival, they became the quiet thread connecting the great Bronze Age world to whatever would rise after it. Imagine this. You walk along a road that no longer remembers where it was supposed to lead. The way stations are abandoned, the palaces that once measured out grain are blackened shells, and the storehouses meant to anchor the world's wealth are silent. Yet along this same quiet dust path, a lone traveller appears pulling a small cart speaking 3 languages, carrying goods that came from farther away than any king now claims to rule. Somehow trade did not die when the empires did. It simply changed shape, shrank into smaller hands, and learned to move quietly across a broken landscape. This is the story of the people who kept the world connected when everything meant to hold it together had fallen apart. What if I told you that the collapse of great palace economies didn't end commerce, but returned it to its most human form? Before the fall, long-distance trade routes stretched from the Aegean to the Levant. from Cyprus to inland Anatolia. These networks were supported by royal granaries, administrative tablets, stored surplus, and a class of bureaucratic managers who oversaw every shipment. When those structures vanished in the late 12th century before the Common Era, one might expect trade to have vanished with it. But the archaeological record tells a different story, one written not in clay tablets or monumental inscriptions, but in scattered shards of pottery, stray beads of foreign glass, and tin ingots arriving in places that no longer had a palace to pay for them. The reveal here is subtle, but profound. When the world broke, small traders stepped into the cracks. Instead of a single integrated economy, hundreds of micro-networks emerged, each one tiny, each one fragile. But together they allowed goods, ideas, and rumours to keep flowing across the old world, even as the great states that once relied on them disappeared. Information begins with the ground truth of archaeology. Across the eastern Mediterranean, post-collapse layers do not show a clean break in exotic materials. They show rearrangement. In Cyprus, minor ports continue to yield evidence of copper smelting and export well after the palatial centres stop recording shipments. In the southern Levant, certain inland sites contain pottery from coastal zones even during periods of political fragmentation, suggesting that someone still carried it inland. In the central highlands, small workshops appear suddenly, producing items that once came from palace-controlled centres. It is as if artisans decided that if the world would no longer bring them goods, they would make those goods themselves. Pottery provides one of our clearest signals. In the decades after the collapse, its distribution patterns shift dramatically. Instead of large, uniform styles tied to state-sponsored production, we see quirky regional variations moving short distances along local trails. This suggests that itinerant potters or small-scale traders carried goods from village to village, filling a role once dominated by bureaucracy. In some regions, new hybrid styles appear, showing that different communities were still meeting each other, exchanging not only goods but ideas. Even in chaos, humans continue to imitate, borrow, and adapt. One of the more striking pieces of evidence comes from the stray presence of long-distance materials that appear with no obvious administrative context. A handful of glass beads in inland Anatolia match chemical compositions known from Levantine workshops far to the south. A bronze tool turned up in a hilltop settlement shows trace elements linking it to copper mines hundreds of kilometres away. These isolated objects do not indicate continuous heavy trade. They indicate continuity of contact, of small-scale movement, of people whose lives were spent on dusty roads carrying whatever could be carried. To imagine these traders, we need to step back from the vision of Bronze Age merchants as palace-trained specialists. After the collapse, they were more likely to be multilingual wanderers, travelling in pairs or small kin groups, relying on personal reputation rather than state authority. Their skills were practical. They knew where the wells were, which villages were safe, who paid in grain and who paid in wool, which paths were patrolled by desperate militias, and which ones were watched only by goats. They memorized landscapes the way scribes once memorized inventories. These traders moved through a world of ruins with remarkable adaptability. Where the sea lanes were still safe enough, coastal communities offered tiny harbours for short-range transport. Inland, rugged trails became the main arteries of exchange. Perhaps their most important tool was not a cart or an animal, but information. Even in the absence of writing, news travelled by mouth, carried by these same people who carried jars of oil or scraps of metal. A trader arriving in a distant village brought not only goods but word of floods, famines, alliances, and the shifting loyalties of chiefs and warlords. The exchange of goods became entangled with the exchange of knowledge, and sometimes the latter was more valuable than the former. Look closely at the pattern. When the big systems collapse, it is often the smallest units that respond fastest. A palace cannot pivot. An empire cannot improvise. But a single trader can change routes in a day, switch goods in a moment, or turn back if danger rises. Their entire economy fits on their back or beside their feet. Another fascinating aspect is the improvisation of currency. In the absence of standardized weights and official seals, value became flexible. Barter returned as a dominant mode of exchange. A bronze knife might be traded for seasonal grain. A jug of oil might pay for safe passage. A shepherd's wool might buy a new grinding stone. Each transaction was individual, negotiated and anchored in personal trust. This is not the collapse of an economy. It is the return of economy to its human scale. There is something almost poetic in this phase of history. In a world once ruled by kings who claimed dominion over everything they could survey, commerce survived not through power, but through movement. Traders became the connective tissue in a world without bones. Resolution comes quietly. When archaeologists map the distribution of goods across the early 12th and 11th centuries before the Common Era, they see something that looks almost like the faint heartbeat of the old world. Not strong, not centrally controlled, not flourishing, but present. And that presence meant survival. These micro-networks kept communities aware of each other. They prevented total isolation. They allowed techniques, materials, and ideas to drift just far enough to keep cultural landscapes alive. And so, the question lingers softly. When everything collapses, what truly holds a world together? The answer, at least in this chapter of human history, seems to be people who walked, people who carried jars, rumours, memories, and hope across territories that no mapmaker was still alive to redraw. People whose names were never written down, whose travels left no written records, but whose footsteps can still be traced in the scattered objects they left behind. As in many moments of collapse, the smallest flows turned out to be the most resilient ones. And although we cannot reconstruct every detail, we know enough to say that trade did not fail, it adapted. And in adapting, it helped carry the ancient world into the next era. You stand on a hill at dawn, overlooking what used to be a world of empires, where palaces once glowed with night fires and the sound of scribes scratching records carried through the air. There are only scattered clusters of smoke rising from small hearths. No kings, no monuments, no armies marching in shining bronze. Just villages, cautious and quiet, wrapped around the bones of older ruins. And yet, here in the stillness, something new is beginning. The people who lost the world of their ancestors have started to build another one, not through grand declarations, but through slow, almost reluctant gathering. This is how kingdoms grow when no one is watching. What if I told you that the earliest Iron Age polities did not begin with conquest, or divine kingship, or sudden leaps in technology, but with the simple act of one settlement becoming slightly bigger than its neighbours? After the collapse of the 12th century, before the Common Era, the landscape of the Eastern Mediterranean was fractured. Great cities had burned or emptied, trade networks thinned to threads, and whole regions were reduced to farmland and hides. But by the early 11th century, before the Common Era, hints of reorganisation began to appear in the archaeological record. Not everywhere at once, and not in the shapes we usually associate with civilization. Instead, small fortified settlements emerged across the highlands of Anatolia, in the valleys of northern Syria, and among the rough foothills that once bordered the Hittite and Mesopotamian spheres. These places were barely more than villages, but their walls tell a larger story. The reveal becomes clear when we consider what walls represent. They are not primarily about defence. though danger was everywhere in the aftermath of collapse. They are about permanence. A community that chooses to build stone fortifications has decided that it will not move again next year or the year after. It is staking a claim to land, water, and memory. And with permanence comes hierarchy, even if it begins gently. Archaeologists studying early Iron Age sites often speak of the appearance of elite houses, structures slightly larger, slightly better made, or positioned in a slightly more commanding location than the others. These details seem minor until we realise that they are the earliest shadows of something new. People beginning to differentiate themselves, to claim leadership, to accumulate authority in a world that had flattened so recently. Information emerges from the soil with quiet precision. At some sites in southeastern Anatolia, modest buildings cluster around central courtyards, with the larger structures the highest ground. The pottery here is local and handmade, but its distribution suggests coordination. Workshops show early attempts at standardized production, not on a palatial scale, but enough to suggest that certain families or clans were directing labour elsewhere. In the northern Levant, faint inscriptions begin to reappear, scratched lightly into stone or pottery, hinting at the return of administrative thinking, even if literacy itself remained rare. The gap between this and the bureaucratic world of the Bronze Age is immense, yet the impulse is similar: communities trying to record, remember, or mark identity. In the shadows of these new settlements, we also find evidence for animal husbandry and agriculture becoming more structured. Herd sizes increase. Grain silos appear in forms suggesting collective storage rather than individual hoarding. This is not a return to palace redistribution. It is something more local, more fragile, but also more flexible. These villages were beginning to act like small states, even if no one inside them yet used that language. It is important to recognise that these early Iron Age polities were not built on the ruins of their predecessors in a literal sense. The grand cities of the late Bronze Age remained largely empty across the 12th and early 11th centuries before the Common Era. Instead, the centres of a new political growth were places that had been peripheral in earlier times: upland towns, minor river valleys, crossroads that once sat in the shadow of royal capitals. In the collapse of the old world, being small had become an advantage. These communities had not been significant enough to attract invaders, or to rely entirely on palatial support, so they survived in small clusters. Now, they were becoming nodes of power in the early Iron Age landscape. Animal bones from early 11th century layers across the Near East show increased frequency of sheep, and goat remains relative to cattle. This suggests a pivot towards species better suited to mobile herding and dry climates. Sheep and goats tolerate harsh terrain, require less water, and reproduce quickly, making them ideal for families who needed dependable, renewable resources. Their increasing presence in regions once dominated by intensive agriculture highlights a clear ecological shift. Imagine a child from one of these nomadic communities walking beside the herd. For them, these lands are not ruined relics. They are pathways, open routes connecting seasonal pastures, waterholes, and temporary camps. Where sedentary populations saw crisis, the pastoralists saw continuity. Archaeology also preserves evidence of flexible shelter construction. Post holes arranged irregularly, shallow pits filled with charcoal, and traces of woven mats or reeds suggest that small groups set up temporary structures in the lee of old walls or under the shade of surviving trees. They often built fire pits against collapsed buildings, using the ruins as windbreaks. These camps were never meant to last. They reflected a worldview that embraced impermanence. Nomadic success was not driven solely by mobility. It also stemmed from their relationship with risk. For farmers, risk was catastrophic. A failed harvest could mean starvation. For pastoralists, risk was manageable. Animals could be traded, slaughtered, or moved depending on conditions. Herd composition could shift, camp routes could adapt. Social bonds could redistribute burdens. This fluidity made pastoralist groups exceptionally capable of navigating landscapes destabilized by drought, warfare, and political collapse. Consider the technological aspect. Pastoralists relied on simpler tools. Their toolkit included slings, spears, knives, and wooden implements. They had no need for elaborate bronze workshops or imported goods. When trade networks faltered, their material culture continued almost unchanged. Their economy, being built on animals, was inherently renewable. A herd that survived one bad season could multiply in the next. A field could not recover so quickly. Archaeological studies show that during the collapse period, the distribution of animal pens and dung layers expands into new territories. This suggests pastoralists occupied regions previously too densely controlled by palace systems. The lions of bureaucracy were gone, and the shepherds moved in nomads also benefited from knowing the land intimately. Their seasonal migrations had always required a map of springs, hidden valleys, and safe routes. In chaotic times, such knowledge became power. Refugees, displaced farmers, and small communities often followed pastoralist trails because they were the only reliable path through an uncertain world. But this era was not without difficulty for pastoralists. Competition over grazing areas could intensify. Drought could force long, dangerous journeys. Conflict with neighbouring groups could erupt without centralised authorities to mediate. Yet even these challenges played into nomadic strengths. They were used to negotiating boundaries, shifting alliances, and protecting herds. They had no walls to fall, no palatial storerooms to lose, no bureaucracies to collapse. They had fewer things that could break. Imagine a broad plain at sunset in the early 11th century before the Common Era. The ruins of a once great city lie on the horizon, its silhouette softened by blown sand. In the foreground, a shepherd whistles and his flock turns, dust rising around their hooves. The world that shaped his ancestors is gone, but his world endures lightly, quietly, without ceremony. If the collapse taught the sedentary world that permanence was an illusion, it showed the pastoralist world that the land still belonged to those who could move with it. The nomads who outlived empires did not outfight them. They outlasted them. Their resilience came not from strength, but from adaptability, not from wealth, but from mobility. And through their survival, they became the quiet thread connecting the great Bronze Age world to whatever would rise after it. A dust-coloured horizon, broken only by the slow movement of herds drifting across scrubland. A few tents stitched from goat hair. A handful of hearths glowing in the evening wind. It looks like the life of people who never stayed anywhere long enough to leave a mark. But then, as you follow the movement of those families through the seasons, you notice something changing. A stone wall here, a watchtower there, a market appearing where once there was only a watering place, and in the middle of it all stands a figure whose authority is no longer only over kin and herd, but over streets, grain stores, and new alliances. This is how nomads became kings in the ruins of old empires. Not through conquest alone, but through slow, deliberate settlement in a world that had forgotten what order meant. What if I told you that the people we later call the Arameans began as clusters of pastoral clans who knew the desert better than any palace bureaucrat ever could? Their strength lay in movement, in reading the land through instinct, in surviving drought, conflict, and scarcity because mobility was a kind of armour. When the Bronze Age world collapsed in the 12th century before the Common Era, mobility became the most valuable survival trait of all. While great cities fell and long-distance trade fractured, pastoralists simply shifted their routes, widened their seasonal ranges, and took advantage of the sudden absence of political control. But by the early 10th century before the Common Era, something changed. These mobile groups began to settle in the ruins of former city-states, claiming land, rebuilding walls, and transforming themselves into rulers. The reveal begins with language. Inscriptions from the early Iron Age show syllabic patterns and personal names that appear across the Levantine interior, marking the spread of a linguistic identity we associate with the Arameans. These inscriptions are not plentiful and not elaborate, but they appear consistently enough to show a community beginning to see itself as part of something larger. This was not an empire. It was a cultural gravity forming among people who had once been scattered. Their dialect connected them. Their pastoral traditions gave them a shared memory, and their new towns gave that memory form. Archaeologically, one of the clearest indicators of Aramean emergence is the construction of fortified town centres across the region, stretching from northern Syria to the fringes of the Euphrates basin. These were not grand cities. They were compact, defensible, pragmatic. Built from rough stone and mud brick, often on hilltops or near reliable water sources, they show a pattern of intentional occupation rather than temporary encampment. The transition from tent to wall is one of the most meaningful shifts in the story of any pastoral society. It marks the moment when mobility becomes choice rather than necessity. When a clan begins to think not only about where it will move next, but about who it is becoming. Information emerges from these sites in the form of domestic debris, spindle whorls for weaving, hearths set into corner rooms, pottery that mixes pastoral traditions with settled craftsmanship. We begin to see small administrative seals, the first signs of property oversight or local governance storage jars multiply in number and size, suggesting the accumulation and redistribution of grain. This indicates an economy beginning to possess a surplus, the first step towards sustaining a governing class. Even the architecture of these early Aramean towns hints at new social hierarchies. Larger houses with central courtyards appear near the town's highest point, while smaller clustered homes fill the lower terraces rank is emerging. Lineage matters again. The rise of Aram-Damascus is the clearest example of this transformation. In the early 10th century before the Common Era, Damascus was not yet the powerful kingdom it would later become. It was a regional centre fed by reliable water from the Brada River and surrounded by small pastoral groups who moved between oasis and foothill. Over time, as these groups settled, Damascus became the meeting place of clans, the site where disputes were negotiated, and the location where a new kind of authority could form. The rulers who eventually appear in inscriptions from Aram-Damascus almost certainly had pastoral ancestry. Their power rested not on ancient dynastic claims, but on the ability to unite mobile groups under the stability of stone. One of the most fascinating aspects of Aramean state formation is the blending of old nomadic values with new territorial ones. Even as they built towns, Aramean identity remained tied to mobility. Their armies were highly flexible, made up of small kin-based units skilled in rapid movement. Their economy still relied heavily on herding, even as agriculture and market exchange increased. Their worldview combined the intimacy of clan structure with the ambitions of kingship. This hybrid identity made them uniquely suited to thrive in the fragmented landscape of the early Iron Age, where the old empires needed bureaucracy to function. The Arameans relied on personal ties. Where other states rose and fell with fragile central administrations, Aramean polities remained resilient because their roots were not urban but relational. Material evidence for this pastoral to urban transition appears in objects such as distinctive Aramean pottery styles, bronze tools bearing local motifs, and household items showing a blend of steppe and settled influences. Some art from this period depicts stylized animals associated with pastoral life, merged with symbols of rulership such as thrones, staffs, and fortified gates. These artifacts tell us that Aramean kingship did not erase the memory of mobility. It transformed it into legitimacy. A king who knew the land, who had herded its animals, who had travelled its harsh edges, possessed an authority rooted in survival rather than divine lineage. Another quietly important detail emerges from settlement patterns. Aramean towns often cluster in networks rather than forming single large capitals. This mirrors the structure of kin alliances among pastoral groups. Instead of centralizing everything in one dominant city, power radiated outward through loosely connected settlements, each led by its own local elite but acknowledging a central ruler when necessary. This distributed model of governance made Aramean states harder to dismantle. No single defeat could destroy them. By the late 10th century before the Common Era, Aram-Damascus was strong enough to exert influence over neighbouring regions, levy tribute, and engage in organised diplomacy. This marks the beginning of Iron Age geopolitics in the Levant. But it is important to remember that this rise did not erase the pastoral past. In fact, it depended on it. The skills needed to survive in a world without empires, adaptation, mobility, kinship, loyalty, and knowledge of terrain, became the tools of governance in the new era. Mobility turned into strategy, clan leadership turned into kingship, and pastoral pragmatism turned into political resilience. The resolution settles like dust over an old campsite. When we examine the rise of Aram-Damascus and the Aramean polities more broadly, we are not witnessing the sudden emergence of new civilizations. We are seeing the slow, careful anchoring of communities who had already survived when others did not. Their kings were not heirs to grand palaces, but descendants of families who once moved through open land with everything they owned tied to an animal's back. Their cities were not built to mimic the empires that came before, but to support the lives of people who valued flexibility above grandeur. And in a world still recovering from collapse, that flexibility was power. A river that once stitched an entire civilization together now feels like a fault line. Its northern delta hums with new power, new generals, new money. Its southern valley, anchored in ancient ritual and memory, answers to a different authority entirely. The Nile still flows as it always has, but the kingdom built on its rhythm has split, silently at first, then unmistakably, into two rival worlds that claim the same heritage, the same gods, the same right to rule. And at the centre of this fracture stands something almost unthinkable: Egypt, the last great survivor of the Bronze Age collapse, now governed not by the descendants of pharaohs, but by families whose ancestors once stood at its borders as foreigners. This is the moment when Egypt becomes two. What if I told you that Egypt did not fall to outsiders, but embraced them, absorbed them, and eventually handed them the keys to the kingdom? To understand how this happened, we need to imagine Egypt in the early 10th century before the Common Era, when the last echoes of the old New Kingdom were fading. The 20th dynasty had survived invasions, famine, inflation, and internal revolt. But survival came with a cost. The empire was gone. Nubia was slipping from control. The military was exhausted. The temple struggled to maintain their estates, and the royal line, once unshakable, had been diminished to a series of aging rulers whose power rested more on memory than on stability. Into this vacuum stepped a group of families whose ancestry traced to the Western Desert. Libyan clans who had migrated into the Nile Delta over generations, their arrival was not sudden. Throughout the late second millennium before the Common Era, Libyan groups moved between raiding, hiring themselves as mercenaries, and settling as pastoral communities along the frontier. The Egyptian state, needing soldiers more than ideology, incorporated them into the army. Over time, these Libyan recruits became captains, and their captains became commanders. By the time the Bronze Age world collapsed beyond Egypt's borders, these military families were no longer outsiders. They were essential to the kingdom's survival. The reveal here is subtle, but powerful. The fragmentation of Egypt was not an invasion. It was an internal rearrangement of authority built on military necessity. By the early 10th century before the Common Era, many of the Egyptian military garrisons in the Delta were commanded by Libyan officers. These officers held land, wealth, and, most importantly, men loyal to them personally, not to the fading pharaoh in the official capital. Their power grew quietly, like tree roots spreading under an old monument. Archaeological evidence shows us the material shadows of this shift. At Tanis, a northern city built on or near the older site of Pyra-Messes, large royal tombs begin to appear that do not carry the lineage of traditional pharaohs, but instead bear names associated with Libyan elites. Their burial goods include blends of Egyptian tradition and foreign elements, amulets carved in classic forms but worn by men whose ancestry lay across the desert, funerary stelae showing Egyptian gods invoked by military officials with Libyan clan identifiers. The symbolism is deliberate. These families were declaring themselves legitimate not by replacing Egyptian culture, but by mastering it. Meanwhile, in the south, Thebes remained the spiritual heart of the Old Kingdom. The great temples of Amun still controlled vast landholdings. The priesthood retained influence, even as the central royal administration waned. Here, local elites defended traditional structures, maintaining the cults that had bound Egypt together for centuries. But their power was increasingly regional. The pharaohs of the late 20th dynasty had leaned heavily on the Theban priesthood, granting them authority to manage temple wealth and local governance. What began as emergency delegation became a parallel political structure. By the beginning of the 21st dynasty, Egypt was effectively divided in practice, if not in name. The kings in the north ruled from Tanis, controlling the delta and its increasingly Libyan-influenced army. The high priests of Amun governed the south from Thebes, controlling religious institutions, local administration, and a great deal of land. Though both sides acknowledged the same pharaonic order, their power bases, economies, and political aims diverged. This quiet division is visible in the archaeological layers of both regions. In the north, burial architecture shifts toward large mud brick complexes associated with military elites. In the south, temple renovations continue but with reduced resources. Administrative documents show increasingly localized control of labor, offerings, and taxation. Even the styles of everyday pottery begin to differ between the two halves of the country, reflecting separate networks of production. Egypt was no longer a single political organism, it was a constellation of regional authorities sharing a river, but not a destiny. The rise of the Libyan dynasties, especially the 22nd dynasty beginning with Shoshank I, must be understood in this context. The Libyan families who had long served in the army of the Delta did not seize power violently. They rose because no one else had the structure to hold Egypt together. Their authority rested not on ancient lineage but on practical control of soldiers, fortifications, and the northeastern approaches to the Nile. While the southern priesthood held ritual power and tradition, the Libyan military households held the means to govern a fragmented landscape. Shoshank I, when he eventually consolidated power in the early 9th century before the Common Era, was not an anomaly but the natural outcome of a century-long shift. His ancestors had been army chiefs. His relatives held command posts across the delta. His clan networks linked fortified towns from western desert oases to eastern frontier settlements. What made his claim to rule viable was not conquest, but accumulated authority. And what made it acceptable to Egyptians was his careful adoption of pharaonic imagery, titles, and religious duties. But in the period we are focusing on, the decades between 980 and 940 before the Common Era, the story is not yet one of unification, it is a story of divergence. Tanis in the north becomes the political capital of the Libyan-rooted elites, while Thebes in the south becomes the religious capital of a priesthood whose power is tied to ancient traditions. Neither side fully rejects the other, but neither submits. Material evidence reveals the tension. In Thebes, tombs of high priests become increasingly elaborate, featuring inscriptions that emphasize their authority over ritual, burial rites, and temple estates. In Tanis, Libyan-derived rulers sponsor construction projects that mirror earlier royal tombs but incorporate stylistic elements foreign to older Egyptian forms. In each region, local identity deepens. The centre has fractured, and the periphery has become the heart of political life. This north-south divide was more than administrative. It reshaped everyday life. Trade routes shifted. Local economies evolved independently. Communities developed distinct ceramic traditions, decoration styles, and manufacturing techniques. The cultural landscape of Egypt began to resemble a mosaic rather than a single coherent design, and yet, for all this fragmentation, we must remember the human aspect. The Libyan families who rose to power were not outsiders bent on destruction. They were integrated into Egyptian society through marriage, service, and generational presence. Their ascent reflects Egypt's adaptability. When old institutions strained under the weight of collapse, new ones emerged, sometimes from unexpected places. The resolution rests in a thought that lingers quietly. Egypt did not fall, it changed shape. The greatest kingdom of the Bronze Age survived the collapse that shattered its neighbours, only to fracture under the slow pressure of internal transformation. The division between Tanis and Thebes was not a sign of failure, but of evolution, the kingdom adapting to a world where unity was no longer necessary for survival. And into that adapted world stepped rulers whose ancestors had once been strangers, but had, through time and resilience, become Egyptian in the deeper sense, responsible for holding together whatever remained. Imagine this. You wake up in a world that no longer remembers what it once was. No emperors, no great bronze fleets crossing the sea, no palatial halls filled with scribes measuring grain by torchlight. And yet, as you step outside, something subtle feels different from the generations of silence before. Fields look fuller, hearths smoke earlier in the morning. The clang of metal carries farther across the hills. Villages that once slept inside ruin walls now build their own. Roads that were overgrown begin to show the faint grooves of travel again. It is not a rebirth. It is not a renaissance. It is something quieter. A world deciding slowly to continue. This is the first light of the Iron Age. What if I told you that the shift we call the beginning of the Iron Age was not a single moment of invention or a clean technological break, but an accumulation of small choices made by people who had already lived through the unthinkable? The collapse of the late Bronze Age had erased kingdoms, languages, and entire ways of life. But as the 10th century before the Common Era opened, scattered communities across the Mediterranean world and Western Asia began to reassemble themselves, not by reconstructing the imperial order they had lost, but by adapting to the world that remained. Their recovery was slow, uneven, and profoundly human. The reveal begins with population. After centuries of decline, archaeological surveys show demographic recovery not in great cities, but in clusters of new rural sites appearing across uplands, valleys, and coastal plains. These settlements are modest, but they grow steadily across the early 10th century before the Common Era. Hearth counts rise, trash pits deepen, grain impressions in pottery multiply. People are eating more regularly and in more places than in the generations after the collapsed fields once abandoned return to cultivation. Terraces appear on slopes that had been empty since the 12th century before the Common Era. Communities that survived on subsistence herding and foraging begin producing surpluses again. This change is not dramatic, but it is enduring, and it marks the foundation of everything that comes next. Information emerges next from metallurgy. Bronze had been the lifeblood of the Old World, requiring complex exchange networks to transport tin from distant sources. When those networks failed, bronze became scarce. Many regions reverted to recycling old metal, melting down tools, weapons, and shattered ritual objects to reforge what they needed. But by the 10th century before the Common Era, ironworking spreads across newly forming polities. Early Iron Age smelting is labour-intensive, smoky and imprecise, producing metal that is brittle or soft unless carefully processed, and yet its raw materials are local. Communities no longer depended on the long-distance routes that once funneled tin into royal arsenals. The shift to iron was not an upgrade. It was an adaptation, a technology that matched the fractured world growing out of ruin. The world didn't get stronger because of iron, it got more self-sufficient. Another quiet transformation appears in writing. After the collapse, literacy had shrunk almost to silence, preserved mainly in temple centres or isolated administrative enclaves. But around this time, a new form of writing emerges in small coastal and inland communities, simplified linear scripts that would later evolve into alphabetic systems. These scripts require fewer symbols, less training, and no palace bureaucracy to maintain. They allow traders, artisans, and local rulers to record agreements, mark ownership, and preserve memory. Writing becomes lighter, more democratic, no longer the exclusive domain of elite scribes. It is as if the world, having lost its written voice, whispers itself back into existence. As metallurgy and writing evolve, so do networks. Not the grand international circuits of the Bronze Age, but webs of local exchange linking village to village, hill town to coastal settlement, and pastoral group to market centre pottery styles move in small arcs across regions, showing contact but not dependence. Iron tools appear in clusters, tracing the roots of itinerant smiths. Raw materials circulate not because kings demanded them, but because communities needed them. These networks do not restore the old order, they create a new one, modest, decentralized, resilient. What makes this moment extraordinary is how different it feels from the world that came before. The Bronze Age was a world of towering powers. The Iron Age begins as a world of small sovereignties, each shaped by the landscape it occupies. The newly forming societies of this period do not try to rebuild the massive palatial economies of the 13th century. Before the Common Era, they cannot. And even if they could, they have learned that such systems are brittle. Instead, they build slowly through kinship, local leadership, and pragmatic cooperation. Archaeology shows this clearly. Storage facilities are larger than those of the immediate post-collapse period, but nowhere near the monumental granaries of the Old Kingdom's fortifications proliferate, but they are modest. Stone circuits around villages, small watchtowers, walls built with materials carried by hand. Even monumental construction, where it occurs, is limited. The world has become cautious. It builds what it can maintain. It invests in durability, not grandeur. In this world, social complexity re-emerges through new forms of leadership. Clan heads become chieftains. Chieftains become local kings. These kings rule not over empires but over networks of settlements that depend on their arbitration, protection, and coordination. Authority is relational rather than bureaucratic. It arises from the ability to gather people, enforce agreements, and maintain stability. And while these leaders often claim descent from divine ancestors or heroic figures, their power rests far more on negotiation than on ideology. This shift in leadership is reflected in burial practices. Wealth begins to show again, but it is measured in local prestige goods rather than imported luxuries. A chief might be buried with iron weapons, decorated pottery, or symbolic ornaments. But the vast troves of gold, silver, and fine bronze characteristic of the late Bronze Age elite graves do not return. Wealth is local. Authority is local. Memory is local. And yet, despite its localism, the emerging Iron Age world is not isolated. Communities exchange goods, ideas, and techniques across greater distances as stability returns. Some of the earliest alphabetic inscriptions appear near coastal routes that would later link the Eastern Mediterranean with new maritime powers. Metallurgical innovations diffuse across regions through the movement of smiths and apprentices. Even religious practices begin to show cross-cultural borrowing, as minor deities migrate between pantheons and ritual objects shift stylistic influences. This moment, the early 10th century before the Common Era, is the hinge between eras. It is not fully post-collapse, but it is no longer collapse. It is not yet the age of great Iron Age kingdoms, but it contains the seeds of everything they will become. It is the moment when humanity steps out from the rubble with enough confidence to build again, not in the old patterns, but in new ones tailored to a changed world. If there is a single thread that binds these transformations together, it is adaptability. Whether through new metallurgy, simpler scripts, decentralized politics, or resilient trade networks, the communities of this era did not restore what was lost. They learned from it. They built systems that did not depend on vast imperial coordination. They invested in skills that could survive fragmentation. They created forms of memory that could be carried in a pocket rather than near a palace archive. The resolution lies not in triumph, but in continuity. The Iron Age begins with people who have known scarcity and fear, who have lived through the erasure of institutions that once seemed eternal. Their strength lies in accepting that nothing is eternal, not empires, not scripts, not economies, and choosing to build anyway. Their world is smaller than the one that fell, but more flexible. Their tools are simpler, but more accessible. Their writing is modest, but more enduring. Their alliances are fragile, but more human. Even after the greatest collapse in ancient history, humanity did what it always does in the long night between ages. It learned, it adapted, and it quietly began again.